Welcome to The Politics People. My guest today is a writer, broadcaster, probably the best known historian in the country. I'm of course talking to Dr. David Starkey. Thank you so much for doing this.
A pleasure.
So these shows are about people who've influenced politics and policy without necessarily being elected politicians. Are you conscious of the influence that you've had over the political direction of the country?
No, I think is a short answer. I don't have a social media presence. I tend to be deeply old-fashioned in what I look at. In other words, I look at things like the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail online, but very little beyond that. So I'm aware, because I've got lots of younger friends who do follow the social media, that there's the world of what we're doing now. There's the world of the podcast. There's a world of, as it were, semi-private media exchange, where I imagine slightly odd voices like mine, slightly odd voices like yours have an impact. But I've no idea how you would measure it at all.
That is such a surprise. If you take something like YouTube,
which I don't use either.
Yeah, and that's amazing because so many people do watch you on YouTube. More than probably any of the other social medias, I think it's kind of important because if you take somebody like you, who, in my opinion, has become very influential because of your appearances on things like Question Time, and obviously lectures, etc., and debates. But if you take those Question Time appearances, they have been poured over on YouTube.
I mean, as I understand it, and again, I'll be truthful, I've never watched it. What happens is that things like the golden moments of Question Time, the Laura Penny and all the rest of it, they become permanent quotes. They exist out of time. And very often, of course, it's a kind of modern version of a dictionary of quotations, isn't it? The reason these clips work is because they have a resonance which goes beyond the particular moment and the particular circumstance under which they were recorded. I mean, I hadn't thought of that before, but I think that idea of a kind of new form of dictionary of quotation is a good one. It's a good idea.
Analogy, actually, yeah, the dictionary of quotations, because that's of course what you're doing is going on the TV appearances and making pithy, concise arguments, but as opposed to being lost to the ages or just quoted and misquoted and just disappearing, they're preserved forever, so that people are armed, if you like, with information and ammunition to be able to take into their everyday life to round out the points that they're trying to make. It's interesting because I do think, you have had such a huge presence in the media, certainly over the last 20 years. How much of this has been deliberate? Have you actually courted a media career?
Not conscious that I was doing it. Not doing it deliberately. In fact, I was thinking about this recently because the man who was the key figure in it, I noticed from my college magazine, died, much younger than me, a former student of mine. Remember, Paul, I've been doing the media, television, radio, since 1977. It's a very, very long time. And that was the year in which I suppose my life divided, thanks to the late Charles Kitchen, who was a terrible historian, jolly nice and amusing chap. He was supposed to be, this is not speaking ill of the dead, I was deeply fond of him. He was supposed to be an RAF cadet. He was at Cambridge. This is when I was still teaching at Cambridge. He was supposed to go on and, fly planes and do all sorts of wonderful things. When he finally got into the RAF after graduating very indifferently, he discovered things like the fact you were supposed to be on the whole sober when you flew a fighter jet. You were occasionally expected to go and wave a weight around in the gymnasium. And none of this was at all suitable for Charles. So he went off and he joined Granada as a researcher. And his first job, this is way back in 77, where on the contrary, it was regarded, those were the days, these were the days of Harold Wilson media tax, tax on independent TV companies, where if you tax profits, of course, it's terribly simple. Nobody makes a profit. So there was an ever-open drinks cabinet. And his first job was to recruit a historian as a fig leaf. I think that's the best way of describing it, for the priapic tendencies. You were talking about white working class trash, which, of course, in a sense, I come to. And it was this program, which in retrospect, you can see was the first piece of reality TV in Britain back in 1977, fronted by Russell Harty. It was called Behave Yourself, and it was real live people from the world of Coronation Street. And they, of course, were there to do what? They were there to talk about eating and sex and sleeping and sex and shopping and sex. And to make it semi-respectable, there was a team of experts. And so there was Nick Humphrey, the great animal behaviourist. There was whoever it was who was the director of the anthropological division of the British Museum, the Museum of Mankind. There was a fashionable Harley Street psychologist. And then they wanted a historian. And Charles claimed it was entirely impossible to find a historian who wouldn't bore the pants off everybody. And finally, the director of the show, John Slater, put Charles's back against the wall and said, "You read history at Cambridge, there has to be somebody." And the response came, "Well, I suppose David Starkey was the least boring historian." Cambridge. And that hearty endorsement, Paul, is the foundation of my entire media career. Everything flowed from that. You can trace, genealogy is one of my interests, and you can trace a kind of family tree going back to that, link after link after link. So through things like the Moral Maze, through the trial of Richard III, through talk radio, and then in the late 90s into the big time with the Tudor history programs overlapping with Question Time. So that's the, and I found it profoundly seductive. The Cambridge of my youth was one doesn't think of Cambridge as being ascetic, but unless you're at somewhere like Peterhouse, Cambridge was very ascetic. But it was regarded as being faintly raffish to drink a half glass of weak sherry before dinner and this kind of thing. And suddenly, plunged into the world of Granada, of Russell Harty, of the lunchtime trip to record at the old Granada studio in Key Street, where in those days were real dining cars, where the Maître D, as I suppose I should call him, was commanded to reserve 2 tables on either side of the aisle. One was for the 4 of us and the other was for our empties, the journey to Manchester. And that table was full by the time. I found this wonderfully, I'm ashamed to say, wonderfully attractive.
Now, what's the point of being in TV if you can't have a little fun? But, one of the things about you that is most impressive is that you've combined a legitimate academic career with a very successful TV profile, and you haven't sacrificed or compromised on either. From where I'm standing, it's a pretty rare position that you hold in popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, remember, I am a conservative radical as a historian. I was at Cambridge in the 60s when the assumption was either a neo-Marxist or a neo-bureaucratic view of history. Everything was about the lower classes, was about big government and so on. Ideas like monarchy, aristocracy, and so on were treated with near contempt. And I'm interested in the 16th century. I said this is absolute nonsense. That was a period of monarchy, it was a period of aristocracy, it was a period of precedence, it was a period of formality. All of these things I was interested in, not because I was some kind of reactionary fop at Peterhouse. There were plenty of those, I can tell you, or old fogey. It simply seemed to me to be true to the period of history that I was doing. So my history has always been a kind of right-wing radicalism, if you like. What makes it peculiar and what makes me peculiar is, A, I happen to be a rather good writer. In other words, I use language in two ways. I think I use it precisely, but I also use it cleverly and wittily and naughtily. You used that word before. I enjoy provoking. I enjoy teasing. I have an extremely sharp sense of humor. And one of the things that I pioneered, and if you look at, and I just hear about them, the great YouTube clips, what they really are, many of them, is a verbal caricature. In other words, I mean, the famous one of the poor old George Austen, the late George Austen, the Archdeacon of York, doesn't his, whatever it was, his fatness, his smugness, and his pomposity genuinely make you want to vomit? Now, look at that. Fatness, smugness, all Anglo-Saxon, and then pomposity, the rolling word. And you just, I'm afraid it figured in the poor man's Times obituary. As the encapsulation of the poor man. And it is this idea of the verbal caricature. And I enjoy, I'm sorry, I am a media tart. I enjoy applause. I enjoy audiences. I've always been unusual amongst almost all academics. Many academics are fond of the sound of their own voices, but they would be perfectly happy to lecture in an empty room, and very often they do, of course. I like the rapport with an audience. I like the dare one say it, the manipulation of an audience. I once, and the word slipped out in a most inappropriate context of a speech day. Nowadays, speech days are occasions where all the kids, not only everybody gets a prize, but everybody puts on a performance. And I was at some school somewhere in the Midlands, I've now forgotten where, and there were some very good performances. And I was explaining how terrific I thought performance was, how it was especially important for boys to learn to do drama, to lose the inhibitions by standing up there and uttering great speeches and all the rest of it. And I said, well, I'm giving a performance now. I'm giving a lecture because, and this was the terrible words that slipped out, I regard public speaking as a bit like oral sex. And I thought, when I said this at a school, and even worse, my eye then caught a woman in a nun's wimple. God. Anyway, what is so interesting afterwards, where a sort of certain rustle went through the audience, the woman turned out then to be the Mother Superior of an associated convent, and came up to me, said, I thought that was wonderful, I knew exactly what you meant. At which point even I fell silent.
I mean, for an academic, for a history professor, you're a very open, gregarious performer on television. Do you think being working class has played into your TV persona in any way?
Yes, I think it's probably more to do with being gay. I think it's probably more important. I was never particularly, the Cambridge that I grew up in didn't fuss unduly about that kind of thing. Remember, I was there, I'm old, I was there in the 1960s. We still had direct grant schools. I don't think in our final year, and of course hardly anybody got firsts in those days, I don't think there was a single person from a leading public school who got a first in history. So and again, you had a choice when you went to Cambridge. Either you became a professional northerner and cranked your accent up, and developed chips on both shoulders as well as eating them, or indeed, One of them of the next generation, who turned out a very great historian, but I shan't mention his name, when he was an undergraduate, was known in the wonderful phrase from Hobbes as nasty, brutish, and short. But a real professional northerner, with the complete D.H. Lawrence combination of minor, father, school teacher, mother, and all that kind of thing. But either you did that, or like me, you, in a sense, declassed, lost accent, and so on. And I very much did that. I think the outsider business, because that's what you're really probing, comes from two other things. It comes from, and again, when you were at a state grammar school in the 1960s, mostly class was neither here nor there. You were there because you were bright, and if you were certainly in the A stream, and that fact was cultivated. People didn't go on about class authenticity or the importance of maintaining a particular vocabulary or style of speech or whatever. Quite the opposite. They were much more interested in where you were going to rather than where you were coming from. But I think the outsider bit comes from two sources. The first is my parents' religion. The fact that they were Quaker, they were members of the Society of Friends. I mean, I rejected it very early. Again, my wicked sense of humor, I would sit through these interminable meetings when the only thing you could do was watch the lovely pattern of the sunlight and the Georgian windows wander across the floor, and listen to these allegedly spiritually provoked interventions. And even at the age of 14, I realized it was perfectly extraordinary that the Holy Ghost invariably seemed to have read the Manchester Guardian. And you never heard the Bible, you heard a great deal about the Guardian. But the social radicalism of Quakerism, its critical approach, its indifference to rank, these things, I think, and its general sense of outsiderdom, I think these things have remained and are important with me.
I always thought the Quakers were more middle class. Am I just wrong about that?
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. My parents were most unusual, especially in somewhere like Kendal. They came, of course, they weren't native to Kendal. They came from Oldham, Rochdale, those awful towns on the northern fringe of Manchester. And the Quakerism there was a different phenomenon. But when they moved to Kendal, my father moving in 35, when he got a job after being unemployed since 1928, 7 years of it, they joined the meeting there. And of course, the meeting in Kendal was profoundly middle class. I mean, the only working class people there were school teachers. The rest of it were the local, not so much gentry, though there were actually gentry, the Coots and Wilsons and whatever, because it was that part of Westmoreland, the northern shore of Morecambe Bay, was one of the great areas of George Fox's pilgrimages of conversion in the late 17th century. And you had a Quaker gentry, and you also had still a Quaker industrial class. When I was a young man, nearly all the firms in Kendal, and Kendal was although we think of it now as a picturesque tourist town, historically it's a commercial town, a manufacturing town, and things like Case Shoes, Isaac Braithwaite's, where my father worked, the Provincial Insurance, all of them, they were all fundamentally Quaker firms. And this is before, Paul, there was this homogenization, before local businesses were bought up and international corporations took over. There was this very high level of social conscience and involvement. I mean, the house that I was brought up in, although it became a council house, had originally been built just before the Second World War by a Quaker trust, which was how my parents got into it. So again, we were insider outsider in the meeting. My mother was never happy there. My father became a significant member of it, and as I said, I was edgy and awkward and never really fully fitted in. I suppose now, well, very quickly lost any kind of religious belief. And what I tend to describe myself as now is the absolute opposite of Quakerism. It's a high church atheist, and the higher the better. because of the beauty of the music and the ritual. I mean, the thing that I found impossible about Quakerism was its lack of ritual. I mean, I've never had more horrible experiences than the Quaker funerals of my parents, especially of my father, because you're supposed to do it yourself. And I was very lucky, still with my father. My aunt, whom I never thought his half sister, I'll be truthful, I never had a high opinion of. She was quite wonderful. I was incapable of saying a word. She handled it beautifully, but I can't comprehend a religion that doesn't have these forms of ritual, of distancing, of layering to deal with the horrors of grief and, of course, the passions of joy. We need things beyond ourselves, which is why I've always been fascinated by literature and fascinated by language. And you need forms that are more than simply the words of every day, the things that come first to your own mouth. You need things that are bigger than yourself. And I'm afraid that, as it were, direct, do it yourself, the idea you marry yourself, don't quite bury yourself, but if they could, they would have you do it. Seems to me to be absolutely not what religion is about.
Well, quite, yeah. Actually, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, I'm not an expert on academia, obviously it's probably apparent, but you were at Cambridge in the 60s and yet you up sticks and moved to the LSE. Why did you prefer the LSE over Cambridge?
I didn't prefer. It was that, again, let's be completely truthful here. My mentor, and a man for whom I have the highest regard and occasionally the deepest contempt, namely Jeffrey Elton. That's a nice phrase, the highest regard and deepest contempt.
Just coined that phrase.
Yes, it's rather good. Jeffrey was absolutely determined I was not going to get a job at Cambridge because I would have been a rival. And he'd already had one rival in the form of Margaret Bowker, and he didn't want another one. And going to LSE was both the best and worst thing, you know, a bit like Dickens' The Best Tale of Two Cities, best of times and worst of times. It was both the best and the worst thing that could have happened to me. But yes, I interrupted you.
Oh, you do me way too much credit describing it as an interruption. No, you're just quite rightly stopping me rambling on. But the full disclosure, you were the first person we approached to do this podcast. You're like the sixth in the series that I've interviewed, but you were the first we actually approached because you kind of embody what the whole idea of this podcast was, talking to people that have gained influence when perhaps they weren't supposed to. So your role as a pundit and as a commentator, you were kind of brought on to panels, for the last couple of decades. You were brought on to make up the numbers so that people like the BBC could say, look, we are even-handed and, we are fair and balanced, etc. But actually, you're always there as an Aunt Sally that, the villain of the piece. But the public responded to you, and then the internet came along and made it possible to reinforce that message. You basically ended up getting influence when you weren't supposed to, and that's kind of what the thrust of this series is about. That's what I'm trying to get to.
The illicit, you see, it's this question of illicit, and I think that you're putting your finger on a whole series of things here, and I have always been interested in the illicit. Remember my work going back to Henry VIII. It had all been dealt with by, allegedly, the reign had been covered. There was a new theory developed by Sir Geoffrey Elton, the man that we are talking about now, who had come up with this theory that the 16th century saw this bureaucratic revolution in which things like monarchy and the direct personal rule of a king were replaced by new forms of rational conciliar government and all the rest of it. And this struck me as an idea. It's completely Germanic. It, of course, is totally rooted in its own time, the big government of the 1940s. And it struck me as being completely preposterous, even as an undergraduate. And I remember I once caused deep horror in his seminar by asking Geoffrey at what moment did he think, and again, it's all been revived by Hilary Mantel, at what moment did he think Thomas Cromwell pointed out to Henry VIII that he was now redundant? I think it was about 3 days before Henry arranged for him to be executed by a highly experienced executioner. But anyway, I did something else, you see. I said, no, this is nonsense. This is real personal monarchy. And then I went even further and I said, in a real personal monarchy, very often, although the formal institutions like the Privy Council, which is the ancestor of the cabinet, are important, it is actually, it's all about people. It's about personal contact. It's about the inner circles. It's about the equivalent, as we now know, it is the equivalent of the Dominic Cummings. It's the equivalent of the Peter Mandelsons. It's the inner world of the actual contact. And of course, in my period, it assumes the most wonderful, flamboyant form, because alongside the formal world of royal advice of the Privy Council, you have the world of the equivalent of the Downing Street or the Whitehall staff, who are called this wonderful word, the Privy Chamber. And they are headed by the man called the Groom of the Stool, whose job it is literally to wipe the royal bottom. And I always said, you know, he's a direct ancestor of Peter Mandelson. What did he do? He acts as the manager of the slush fund. He acts as the means of access to the king for mistresses, for private advice. In other words, there is this entire world of, if you like, behind the curtain, behind the arras, behind the hand, this whispered secret world. And of course, the more that happens now, the more we now know this is how government really works, even behind the facade of democracy. And what we've seen happen, I think, Paul, and again, one of the reasons that you, me, and everybody else is starting to have the effect that we do is that the decent curtains, the decent draperies of public pretense, that it's all about the commons, that it's all about collective responsibility in the cabinet, these have been ripped off and are being progressively ripped off. And what we see underneath is the nakedness of what I've been talking about. And again, we've left out another area where I was for a period very influential, which is acting as this marvelous thing called a constitutional historian, which is a polysyllabic way of saying somebody who can put an intellectual gloss on royal gossip. I was quite important in the 90s with the dissolution of the marriage of Charles and Diana and all the rest of it. And do you know how I got into it? Because I knew about the Tudor monarchy. And fundamentally, nothing had actually changed. And if you look to the collapse, the tragic and very, very sad collapse of the marriage of Charles and Diana, it's very similar in a fundamental way to the various collapses of Henry VIII's marriages. You're dealing with a marriage which is both a profoundly personal relationship and also, as it were, a public piece of theatre. And what you're seeing is the absolutely irreconcilable tension between those two things. And especially as in the 20th century monarchy, where a royal marriage was turned into a kind of neo-sacrament, presenting the infinite and superior manifestation of the central element of British society, which is the wonderful and glorious British family, which is exemplified most perfectly in the royal family. And we now in the 30-year wreckage which has followed from the 1990s, we can't begin to understand how serious the series of ruptures, the earthquakes which tore that structure apart were. And again, I was on the side of the illicit, the man who said the emperor's got no clothes, who indeed pointed out that Charles not only had no clothes, but was interested in indecent instruments with Camilla, and so on. And it is again, I suppose, so much of my life, and it's interesting thing. When you get to my age, you become awfully autobiographical and retrospective. I suppose mostly in my life, professional and media, and very often private too, my essential role has been the little boy in the crowd saying, "Look, Mummy, the emperor's got no clothes on and he's got a big willy." As very appropriate in the age of Boris Johnson, isn't it? Yes.
So, are we going through the Tudor period again now? Are we revisiting it? Basically, is Brexit the equivalent of our break from Rome?
Yes, it is. It's a second Reformation. It's a second Reformation. And indeed, when we're on the eve of the 2016 referendum, and you remember until the very last minute, it looked an absolute shooting certainty that Cameron would get his way and that we would vote to remain in. I was sort of meditating on pieces called, The Death of Henry VIII's England. And then, of course, the British people did the absolute opposite. And in all sorts of ways, Henry VIII's England is still very much with us. And it is no accident, as I point out whenever anybody will listen to me, that the reason that the vote goes in such different ways in England and Scotland is fundamentally to do with two very different reformations. The Scottish Reformation was a completely ordinary European Reformation in which people like Knox consciously looked to European models, to the role of the best reformed churches of Switzerland and all the rest of it, and it was carried out in the teeth of opposition by the monarchy and forced upon it. Whereas in Britain, when England, it was completely different. It was a profoundly nationalistic movement, led and directed by the king for his own purposes, and of course, above all, creating a sense of an island mentality. Our notion of ourselves as an island, I don't think is something that's intrinsic. Yes, I know, England is an island and all the rest of it. But the idea of the island mentality, to a very significant extent, is a creation of Henry VIII. I mean, not only do you get the actual break with Rome and so on, you literally fortify England. I mean, I'm working on this at the moment. Henry VIII's first experience as a boy when he goes to his father, 13-year-old, when he ceases his education in his own princely household and he goes to his father's court in 1504. I mean, his father is surprisingly humane about how he handles him. He says, "Okay, you're going to come and live at court, but what we're going to do first, we're going to go on a holiday. We're going to go on a royal progress, and I'm going to show you very important chunks of England. I'm going to take you around Kent and down into Sussex and Hampshire and down to, and then we can go and look at the ships at Portsmouth and do all that kind of thing, and we'll go back to London." And one of the things that he sees in Kent is this extraordinary medieval fortress that had been built by Edward III called Queenborough Castle, which has now vanished, which is a totally circular castle. It's a sort of wheels and wheels. Well, it was before it was demolished in the Civil War. And Henry is profoundly fascinated by this. And when 30 years later, he becomes the king who's broken with Europe, and England is the pariah, and the equivalent of Monsieur Barnier is very cross with us, and invasion threatens. What Henry does, he takes that youthful memory and he constructs a series of coastal forts that turn England literally into a fortified island. And then he creates the thing of which, of course, I'm now a trustee. He creates the Mary Rose and the other pioneer warships that mean you've got a stone and gun wall on land, and then you've got wooden and guns in these extraordinary battle fleets that protect England in a way which is completely different from the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, because you're an island, you're susceptible to invasion. We think that the last time we were invaded is the Norman conquest. This is rubbish. We're invaded right through the Middle Ages. Every one of those shifts of dynasty of the Middle Ages, the coming of the Yorkists, the coming of the Tudors is an invasion. Henry VII comes with a French fleet, with French troops, with French money. In 1485, it stops with Henry. And in other words, you create a sense of an embattled island. You create a sense of the English Channel as the widest strip of water in the world. You create that sense of difference, us and them, on either side of it. And again, I encountered many of these things when I was very, very young. My first school trip, there were school trips in those days, which for a boy of my background was wonderful. I went to Rome at the age of 13. And I remember my mother, when I explained to her, remember, Northern working class Puritan, explained to her the school trip was going to go to Rome. This look of horror came upon her. And she couldn't really say what she wanted to say, but I can still remember the way she put it. Now, David, wash your hands very carefully. They have funny toilet habits. That entire world of, and it was absolutely true, as turned up, whatever. That entire world of anti-Roman, anti-Catholic propaganda, 500 years worth of it, were put in that little remark, 1930s obsessional hygiene. And that struck me at the time, and of course, ever since, I learned about its origins and how it was developed. And the great speeches in Shakespeare, this land of England, the John of Gaunt speech in Richard II and all the rest of it, they come directly from Henry VIII's propaganda in the 1530s. So it's not simply the sense of difference and separation. It's things which are more powerful, which are deeper, which are deep-seated rhetoric, that sense of difference, the oddity. I mean, England's relations with continental Europe have always been, since Henry VIII, they've always been very odd. We are both fascinated by it because it's a bit dirty, it's a bit sexy, funny foreign food and all of this stuff. It's that sense of the exotic, which is both deplorable and disgraceful, and something that good people like us don't do. And of course, like E.M. Forster, God, I want to get into that. And this is Henry.
So does your role as an historian give you any insight into what might be coming next?
Heaven only knows. I mean, the world has been knocked sideways, hasn't it, by our extraordinary little play. Well, it is a little plague, but which has created this bizarre reaction. I mean, in the 16th century, they had real plagues, terrible things like sweating sickness, and they did sensible things. The rich ran away and left the poor to die. Nowadays, of course, we're doing something completely different. Rather than waiting for the plague to damage the economy, we've decided to kill the economy to spare the effects of the plague. And heaven knows what lies on the other side of that. Anybody who ventures to prophesy in the current situation, I think, is a fool.
And there's a lot of them about. Dr. David Starkey, I can't thank you enough for talking to me today.
A pleasure.
I hope we get the chance to do it again soon. Thank you so much.